On the Pleasures of No Longer Being Very Young by G.K. Chesterton. There are advantages in the advance through middle age into later life, which are very seldom stated in a sensible way. Generally, they are stated in a sentimental way. In a general suggestion that all old men are equipped with beautiful snowy beards like Father Christmas and rejoice in unfathomable wisdom like Nestor. All this has caused the young people to be skeptical about the real advantages of the old people, and the true statement of those advantages sounds like a paradox. I would not say that old men grow wise, for men never grow wise, and many old men retain a very attractive childishness and cheerful innocence. Elderly people are often much more romantic than young people, and sometimes even more adventurous, having begun to realize how many things they do not know. It is a true proverb, no doubt, which says, "There is no fool like an old fool." Perhaps there is no fool who is half so happy in his own fool's paradise. But however this may be, it is true that the advantages of maturity are not those which are generally urged even in praise of it. And when they are truly urged, they sound like an almost comic contradiction. For instance, one pleasure attached to growing older is that many things seem to be growing younger, growing fresher and more lively than we once supposed them to be. We begin to see significance, or in other words, to see life in a large number of traditions, institutions, maxims, and codes of manners that seem in our first days to be dead. A young man grows up in a world that often seems to him intolerably old. He grows up among proverbs and precepts that appear to be quite stiff and senseless. He seems to be stuffed with stale things, to be given the stones of death instead of the bread of life, to be fed on the dust of the dead past, to live in a town of tombs. It is a very natural mistake, but it is a mistake. The advantage of advancing years lies in discovering that traditions are true and therefore alive. Indeed, a tradition is not even traditional except when it is alive. It is great fun to find out that the world has not repeated proverbs because they are proverbial, but because they are practical. Until I owned a dog, I never knew what is meant by the proverb about letting a sleeping dog lie, or the fable about the dog in the manger. Now those dead phrases are quite alive to me, for they are parts of a perfectly practical psychology. Until I went to live in the country, I had no notion of the meaning of the maxim, "It's an ill wind that blows nobody good." Now it seems to me as pertinent and even pungent as if it were a new remark, just made to me by a neighbor at the garden gate. It is something to come to live in a world of living and significant things instead of dead and unmeaning things. And it is youth in revolt, even in righteous revolt, which sees its surroundings as dead and unmeaning. It is old age, and even second childhood that has come to see that everything means something and that life itself has never died. For instance, we have just seen a staggering turn of the wheel of fortune which has brought all the modern material pride and prosperity to a standstill. America, which a year or two ago seemed to have become one vast El Dorado studded with cities of gold, is almost as much embarrassed as England, and really much more embarrassed than Ireland. The industrial countries are actually finding it difficult to be industrial, while the old agricultural countries still find it possible to be industrious. Now, I do not pretend to have prophesied or expected this, for a man may cheerfully call a thing rotten without really expecting it to rot. But neither certainly did the young, the progressive, the prosperous, or the adventurous expect it. Yet all history and culture is stiff with proverbs and prophecies telling them to expect it. The trouble is that they thought the proverbs and history a great deal too stiff. Again and again, with monotonous reiteration, both my young friends and myself had been told from childhood that fortune is fickle, that riches take to themselves wings and fly, that power can depart suddenly from the powerful, that pride goes before a fall, and insolence attracts the thunderbolt of the gods. But it was all unmeaning to us, and all the proverbs seemed stiff and stale like dusty labels on neglected antiquities. We had heard of the fall of Wolsey, which was like the crash of a huge palace, still faintly rumbling through the ages. We had read of it in the words of Shakespeare, which possibly were not written by Shakespeare. We had learned them and learned nothing from them. We had read 10,000 times to the point of tedium of the difference between the Napoleon of Marengo and the Napoleon of Moscow. But we should never have expected Moscow if we had been looking at Marengo. We knew that Charles V resigned his crown or that Charles I lost his head, and we should have duly remarked after the incident, but not before it, sic transit gloria mundi. We had been told that the Roman Empire declined or that the Spanish Empire disintegrated, but no German ever really applied it to the German Empire and no Briton to the British Empire. The very repetition of these truths will sound like the old interminable repetition of the truisms. And yet they are to me at this moment like amazing and startling discoveries, for I have lived to see the dead proverbs come alive. This, like so many of the realizations of later life, is quite impossible to convey in words to anybody who has not reached it in this way. It is like a difference of dimension or plane in which something which the young have long looked at rather wearily as a diagram has suddenly become a solid. It is like the indescribable transition from the inorganic to the organic, as if the stone snakes and birds of some ancient Egyptian inscription began to leap about like living things. The thing was a dead maxim when we were alive with youth. It becomes a living maxim when we are nearer to death. Even as we are dying, the whole world is coming to life. Another paradox is this, that it is not the young people who realize the new world. The moderns do not realize modernity. They have never known anything else. They have stepped on to a moving platform which they hardly know to be moving, as a man cannot feel the daily movement of the earth. But he would feel it sharp enough if the earth suddenly moved the other way. The older generation consists of those who do remember a time when the world moved the other way. They do feel sharply and clearly the epoch which is beginning, for they were there before it began. It is one of the artistic advantages of the aged that they do see the new things relived sharply against a background, their shape definite and distinct. To the young, these new things are often themselves the background and are hardly seen at all. Hence, even the most intelligent of innovators is often strangely mistaken about the nature of innovation and the things that are really new. And the oldest inhabitant will often indulge in a senile chuckle as he listens to the village orator proclaiming that the village church will soon be swept away and replaced by a factory for chemicals. For the oldest inhabitant knows very well that nobody went to church in the days of his childhood except out of snobbishness, and that it is in his old age that the church has begun once more to be thronged with believers. In my capacity of oldest inhabitant, with senile chuckle, I will give one instance of a kindred kind. A man must be at least as old as I am in order to remember how utterly idiotic, inconceivable, and crazily incredible it once seemed that any educated or even reasonable shrewd person should confess that he believed in ghosts. You must be nearly the oldest inhabitant to know with what solid scorn and certainty the squire and the parson denied the possibility of the village ghost. The parson even more emphatically than the squire. The village ghost was instantly traced to the village drunkard or the village liar. Educated people knew that the dead do not return in the world of sense. Those who remember those times and have lived to see a man of science like Sir Oliver Lodge founding quite a fashionable religion are amused to hear a young man say the world is moving away from the supernatural. They know in what direction it has really moved.